A horse that's always been calm and obedient suddenly goes wild the moment he sees a girl in the crowd. He rears up, eyes wide, heart pounding, like he's seen a ghost. His owner struggles to control him. But the girl, she just stands there, frozen, tears in her eyes, because she knows exactly why the horse is reacting this way. But what's their connection, and what secret from the past is about to be uncovered? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the county fairgrounds as Mark Lawson guided his horse through the bustling crowd. The sweet scent of cotton candy mixed with the smoky aroma of grilled corn and barbecue. Children darted past with sticky fingers and painted faces, while parents called after them with gentle warnings to slow down. Mark kept a loose hold on Apollo's lead rope, knowing the retired racehorse wouldn't spook at the chaos around them. The gorgeous chestnut gelding walked calmly beside him, his coat gleaming like polished copper in the evening light. Well, if it isn't Mark Lawson and the great Apollo. A man in a cowboy hat approached, grinning widely. "How's retirement treating this old champion?" Mark patted Apollo's muscular neck. "Better than it's treating me, Tom. This boy still thinks he's 5 years old some days." "Hard to believe he's the same horse that won the Valley Cup," another fairgoer chimed in, stopping to admire Apollo's powerful build. "Don't let his age fool you," Mark said with pride. "He's still got the heart of a champion. Just yesterday, he outran my younger horses in the paddock, just to show off." As they approached the main event area, the familiar sounds of the fair, the carousel music, the announcer's voice over the speakers, the excited chatter of the crowd, suddenly faded into the background. Apollo's ears shot forward, his entire body tensing like a coiled spring. Mark felt the change instantly. "Easy, boy," he murmured, but Apollo wasn't listening. The horse's eyes locked on something in the distance. Following his gaze, Mark spotted a teenage girl standing by the metal railing. She wore jeans and a simple blue t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. But what caught Mark's attention was her expression. She stared at Apollo as if she'd seen a ghost. Without warning, Apollo reared up, his front hooves pawing at the air. His usually gentle demeanor vanished as he let out a desperate, almost mournful neigh that seemed to echo across the fairgrounds. People scattered, giving them a wide berth. "Whoa, Apollo, easy!" Mark struggled to maintain control, his experienced hands working to bring the horse back down. He'd never seen Apollo act like this before. The girl gripped the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. Her face had drained of all color, and her hands visibly trembled. The look in her eyes shifted from shock to something deeper, a raw, heartbreaking pain that seemed too heavy for someone so young. Before Mark could make sense of what was happening, the girl backed away from the railing. Her eyes never left Apollo as she took one step, then another, before turning and disappearing into the sea of faces and bodies that filled the fairgrounds. Apollo's hooves returned to earth, but his body still thrummed with tension. He stretched his neck in the direction the girl had gone, letting out a soft, almost pleading, nickering sound. Mark ran a soothing hand down Apollo's neck, feeling the horse's rapid heartbeat slowly steadying beneath his palm. "What the hell was that about?" he muttered under his breath, watching the spot where the girl had vanished. Something wasn't right here, and he intended to find out what it was. The evening air grew cooler as the fair's bright lights began to dim one by one. Mark led Apollo through the quieting fairgrounds, his mind still troubled by the strange incident earlier. The sound of their footsteps mixed with distant carnival music and the occasional laugh of lingering fairgoers. As they approached the stables, Mark noticed a shadow move near Apollo's stall. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing a slight figure perched on a hay bale. It was the girl from earlier, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Apollo's reaction was immediate, but gentler this time. He nickered softly, stretching his neck toward her. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 16, didn't move, but her eyes never left the horse. "You okay there?" Mark kept his voice low and gentle, not wanting to startle her. She jumped slightly anyway, as if pulled from deep thoughts. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be here." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Seems like Apollo disagrees," Mark said, nodding toward the horse, who was still straining to get closer to her. "You two know each other?" The girl's hands twisted in her lap. "His name used to be Morning Glory," she said softly. I was his first rider." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "You're Lila?" She nodded, finally meeting his eyes. "I trained with him when he was just starting out, before ... Her voice cracked. "Before the accident." Mark leaned against the stable door, giving her space to continue. Apollo stood perfectly still now, his ears focused entirely on Lila's voice. "We were practicing for his first real race," she continued, her words coming faster now. "I pushed him too hard. There was a jump. We'd done it 100 times before, but that day..." She wrapped her arms around herself. "We crashed, hard. I was okay, just a broken arm, but Glory, Apollo, he hurt his leg. Everyone said he'd never race again." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "My parents sold him while I was still in the hospital. They said it was for the best, that I needed to focus on school instead of racing. I never even got to say goodbye." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken pain. Lila suddenly stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't belong here," she whispered, already backing away. Before Mark could respond, she turned and hurried into the darkness, her footsteps fading quickly on the packed dirt. Mark watched her go, then turned to Apollo, who pawed at the ground restlessly. "She's the reason you acted like that, isn't she?" he murmured, reaching up to stroke the horse's nose. Apollo's only response was a soft whicker, his eyes still fixed on the spot where Lila had disappeared. That night Mark tossed and turned in his small trailer, the fair's distant generators humming in the background. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lila's tear-stained face and Apollo's unusual behavior. Something wasn't adding up. The clock on his bedside table read 2:47 a.m. when he finally gave up on sleep. Sitting up, he clicked on the lamp and pulled out his worn leather notebook. He'd kept detailed records of Apollo's paperwork from when he'd bought him 3 years ago. The previous owner had been a show-jumping facility in Kentucky, and before that, a small private stable in Ohio. But the trail went cold after that. As the first rays of sunrise painted the sky, Mark was already in his truck, heading toward the old racing circuit where he knew he'd find Jimmy Chen, a retired trainer who'd been around forever and knew everyone's business. He found Jimmy in his usual spot at the track's cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee. The elderly trainer's eyes lit up with recognition as Mark slid into the booth across from him. "Jimmy, I need to ask you about a horse. Used to go by Morning Glory, now called Apollo." Jimmy's weathered face creased with concern. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Sweet horse. Terrible story." He stirred his coffee slowly. "Used to belong to the Carter girl, Lila. They were something special together, those two. She had a natural touch, and that horse would have run through fire for her." Mark leaned forward. "What happened?" "It was during qualifiers for the junior circuit." Jimmy's voice grew softer. "They were doing great, right up until that last jump. Horse caught his front hoof on the rail. Went down hard. Lila hit the ground first. Then the horse rolled. He shook his head. Found out later, the ground had been too soft from rain the night before. Nobody should have been jumping that day. How bad was it? Lila got the worst of it. Severe concussion, shattered collarbone, broken arm. Doc said she was lucky to be alive. Horse nearly broke his leg, but it was just a bad sprain. Thing is, after she recovered, she wouldn't go near the stables. Kept saying she was bad luck, that she'd ruined Apollo's life. Jimmy sipped his coffee. Her folks sold him to Green Meadows Farm while she was still recovering. After that, he bounced around. Nobody could handle him right. He'd get restless, act up. Guess he never got over her either. Mark drove back to the fairgrounds, his mind heavy with this new information. The morning crowds were starting to file in, but there was no sign of Lila among them. Apollo whinnied as Mark approached his stall, seeming to search the faces in the crowd. "We'll find her, buddy," Mark promised, patting Apollo's neck. The horse nudged his shoulder as if understanding the weight of those words. The final day of the fair dawned bright and clear, with scattered clouds drifting lazily across the summer sky. Mark had spent the morning checking his trailer and getting Apollo ready for the journey home when he spotted her. Lila sat alone on a wooden fence at the edge of the fairgrounds, her feet dangling as she watched families pack up their stalls and exhibits. Mark took a deep breath and walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. Without saying a word, he settled onto the fence beside her, leaving enough space so she wouldn't feel crowded. "I talked to Jimmy yesterday," he said quietly, keeping his eyes on the bustling fairground. "He told me what happened after your accident, about how Apollo went from place to place." Lila's shoulders tensed, but she didn't move away. Seems no one could keep him for long. He'd get antsy, act up, wouldn't settle. Mark glanced at her profile, noting how she blinked rapidly, almost like he was looking for someone. A tear slid down Lila's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. Her hands gripped the wooden fence tighter, knuckles turning white. "I've got a small ranch about 20 minutes from here," Mark continued, his voice gentle. "Why don't you come by sometime? No pressure, no expectations. Just come see him." Lila shook her head firmly. "I can't," she whispered. I'm not that person anymore." Mark nodded and slid off the fence. He took a few steps, then turned back. "Just think about it," he called over his shoulder, leaving her with her thoughts. The sun was setting when Mark finished loading the last of his equipment into the trailer. Apollo stood tied to the side, his coat gleaming in the golden light. Mark was doing one final check of the hitches when he heard footsteps behind him. "If I come, I'm just visiting." Lila's voice was firm, though her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. Mark couldn't help but grin. "That's all I'm asking." Apollo lifted his head and snorted softly, his ears pricked forward as if he understood every word. A few days later, Mark stood outside the stable, running a brush along Apollo's gleaming coat while keeping one eye on the entrance. Right on time, a blue pickup truck appeared, rolling slowly toward the gate. The truck's engine cut off, and Lila emerged, her movements cautious and measured. She had her backpack strap clutched tight against her shoulder, knuckles white from the grip. Her eyes swept across the property, taking in the weathered barn, the neat paddocks, and the handful of horses grazing in the distance. "Morning," Mark called out, keeping his voice casual. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she struggled to put one foot in front of the other. "Welcome to Lawson Ranch." Lila managed a small nod, following as Mark gave her an easy tour. He pointed out the feed room, introduced her to the other horses, a gentle mare named Sugar, and an elderly gelding called Duke. 2 border collies, Max and Betty, trotted alongside them, their tails wagging hopefully for attention. When they finally approached Apollo's area, the change was instant. The horse's head shot up, ears pricking forward like radar dishes. His tail began to swish back and forth, and his hooves shifted restlessly against the ground. Lila stopped breathing for a moment. Her hand lifted automatically toward Apollo, fingers stretching out, but then fear flickered across her face, and she yanked it back as if burned. Mark pretended to be busy with something in his pocket, giving her space to collect herself. "Let's start small," he said, holding out a soft brush. "Just help me groom him." Lila stared at the brush for what felt like an eternity. Finally, her fingers closed around the handle. She took a single step forward, then another. Apollo remained perfectly still, barely even blinking as she began to run the brush along his side. Her strokes were hesitant at first, but gradually became more confident. The familiar motion seemed to calm her, and some of the rigidity left her shoulders. She leaned in closer, and Mark heard her whisper something, too soft for him to make out, but Apollo's ears twitched at the sound. The horse let out a deep, contented breath and turned his head, pressing his velvet nose against her shoulder. Mark watched in silence, recognizing the importance of this moment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The morning melted into afternoon as Lila threw herself into the ranch work. Her movements were mechanical at first, like she was running on autopilot as she scooped fresh bedding into the stalls and filled water buckets. But with each task, her shoulders relaxed a little more, her breathing becoming easier. Mark kept the conversation light, sharing stories as they worked side by side. "You know, first time Apollo saw a plastic bag blowing across the paddock, he jumped so high I thought he was trying to reach the moon," he chuckled, measuring out feed. "Took me 3 days to convince him they weren't horse-eating monsters." Lila's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. She continued brushing Apollo's coat, her strokes becoming more confident with each pass. As the sun climbed higher, Mark suggested they break for lunch. Lila perched herself on the wooden fence, her legs dangling as she watched Apollo graze peacefully in the nearby paddock. His dark coat gleamed in the sunlight as he moved, selecting choice patches of grass with careful precision. Mark joined her, passing over a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds being the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant nickering of horses. Finally, Lila's voice broke through the quiet. "I used to think he hated me, after what happened." Her words came out barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on Apollo. Mark shook his head, taking a thoughtful bite of his sandwich. "Horses don't hold grudges. If he hated you, he wouldn't have reacted the way he did at the fair." Lila fell silent again, mulling over his words as she picked at the crust of her sandwich. The truth of what he said seemed to sink in slowly, like rain into dry earth. When it was time to leave, Lila lingered by Apollo's stall. This time, there was no hesitation as she reached out to touch his muzzle. Apollo responded immediately, pressing his nose into her palm, a gesture so familiar it seemed to bridge the years between them. A tear escaped down Lila's cheek, catching the afternoon light. She quickly wiped it away with her free hand. "I'll come back tomorrow," she mumbled, already turning toward the door. Mark leaned against the stable wall, a knowing smile spreading across his face as he watched her hurry away. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with wisps of fog still clinging to the grass. Lila's truck pulled up right on time, and Mark greeted her with a simple nod as she approached the barn. No words were needed. They fell easily into the morning routine they'd established just yesterday. This time, Lila moved through the stable with growing confidence. Her steps were sure as she grabbed the feed bucket, measured out Apollo's breakfast, and checked his water. Her movements were fluid, natural, like muscle memory slowly awakening after a long sleep. As the morning wore on, Mark approached her while she was finishing up with Apollo's grooming. "Want to walk him around the training paddock?" he asked casually, holding out the leather reins. Lila hesitated for just a moment before nodding, taking the reins from his hands. Apollo followed her willingly, his hooves making soft thuds against the packed earth as they made their way to the paddock. Everything was fine until they reached the starting line, that familiar spot where countless training sessions had begun years ago. Lila's feet suddenly wouldn't move. Her breath caught in her throat as memories crashed over her like a wave. The thundering of hooves, the sudden stumble, the world tilting sideways, the sickening crunch of impact. She could almost feel the sharp pain in her collarbone, hear the panicked whinnying, see Apollo struggling to get up. Her hands trembled on the reins, but Apollo remained perfectly still beside her. He turned his head slightly, warm breath ghosting over her shoulder as he waited patiently. The big horse seemed to understand exactly what was happening, staying steady as an anchor while Lila battled her demons. From his spot by the fence, Mark watched silently. His fingers tapped against the wooden rail, but he made no move to intervene. This was Lila's fight, and she needed to face it on her own terms. The seconds stretched into minutes as Lila stood frozen at the starting line, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Then slowly, she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. She took one deep, shaky breath and moved her right foot forward. That first step was the hardest, but each one after became a little easier. She led Apollo around the ring, her steps gradually becoming steadier. The memories didn't vanish. They were still there, hovering at the edges of her mind, but they no longer held her captive. Mark nodded approvingly as he watched them complete their circle. This wasn't just a walk around the paddock. It was Lila's first real victory over her fear. The days melted into a comfortable routine at the ranch. Every morning, Lila's truck would rumble up the gravel driveway, just as the sun peeked over the horizon. She'd slip into the stable, breathe in the familiar scent of hay and horses, and begin her daily tasks. Apollo grew more animated with each visit, his ears perking up at the sound of her footsteps. He'd stretch his neck over the stall door, nickering softly as she approached with his breakfast. Their bond, though once fractured, was healing day by day. Mark watched from a distance as Lila moved through the stable with growing confidence. She knew every corner now, every tool's place, every horse's quirk. But there was one area she carefully avoided, the tack room, where Apollo's saddle hung unused on its stand. The routine continued. Brush, feed, walk the paddock, repeat. Some days they'd talk, other days they'd work in comfortable silence. But the subject of riding never came up. It hung in the air between them, unspoken but ever present. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Lila found herself alone in the stable. Most of the other workers had gone home, and the horses were settling in for the night. Her feet carried her to the tack room, where Apollo's saddle sat. Her fingers traced the worn leather, following the familiar curves and creases. Each scratch and scuff told a story, some happy, some painful. She remembered the excitement of their first training sessions, the pride of their early victories, and then the accident. But for the first time, the good memories didn't immediately get swallowed by the bad ones. "It's not about whether you can ride again," Mark's voice came from behind her, making her jump slightly. She hadn't heard him approach. "It's about whether you want to." Lila's fingers tightened around the saddle's edge, her knuckles turning white with the pressure. The leather creaked under her grip as she stared at it, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted. I'm afraid." Mark's weathered face broke into a gentle smile. "Fear means you still care." She stood there for a long moment, letting his words sink in. Then, without saying anything, she lifted the saddle from its stand. It felt heavier than she remembered, or maybe that was just the weight of everything it represented. Slowly, deliberately, she carried it to Apollo's stall. The horse watched her with curious eyes as she approached. She didn't mount up, didn't even open the stall door. Instead, she simply hung the saddle on the hook outside his stall. A silent promise, both to herself and to Apollo. She didn't ride that night, but she'd made her choice. She was ready to try. The morning air was crisp and still at the ranch, carrying the sweet scent of fresh hay through the stables. Lila stood motionless by Apollo's stall, the familiar weight of the saddle heavy in her trembling hands. A few yards away, Mark leaned against a post, watching silently. He knew this moment had to be entirely her choice. Sunlight streamed through the stable windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Apollo watched Lila with gentle eyes, his ears forward and attentive. He hadn't changed much since their early days together. His coat still gleamed like polished copper in the morning light. Drawing in a deep breath, Lila finally stepped into the stall. Her movements were careful but sure as she placed the saddle on Apollo's broad back. Her hands shook while she worked the girth strap, double-checking its tightness just as she'd done hundreds of times before. Mark approached without hurry, his boots scuffing quietly against the floor. "You want a boost?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Lila paused, then gave a small nod. With practiced ease, Mark helped her up, and suddenly she was seated in the saddle. The familiar position hit her like a wave. This was where she'd spent countless hours of her youth, where she'd felt most alive. Apollo stood perfectly still beneath her, patient and steady. Lila's fingers wrapped tightly around the reins, but she couldn't make herself move. The memory she'd been holding back crashed over her. The sickening sensation of falling, the sharp pain that had followed, the overwhelming fear that had never quite left her. "Breathe," Mark's gentle reminder cut through her rising panic. "One step at a time." Lila forced herself to take a shaky breath. Her heel moved slightly, and Apollo responded immediately, stepping forward into a careful walk around the paddock. Each step was measured, deliberate, as they made their way around the familiar space. The minutes felt like hours. Sweat beaded on Lila's forehead despite the cool morning air. When the panic finally became too much, she pulled Apollo to a stop and quickly dismounted. "That's enough for today," she said, her voice tight with emotion. Mark simply nodded. "You did good, kid." With trembling hands, Lila began brushing Apollo down, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. She'd done it, taken the first step, but she knew the road ahead would be far from easy. The early morning mist still clung to the grass as Lila led Apollo from his stall. This had become their ritual over the past weeks, quiet moments together before the sun fully rose. She'd arrive just as Mark was starting his morning chores, exchange a quick nod, and head straight for Apollo's stall. Their rides were simple, just walking, nothing more. Around and around the small practice ring they'd go, Lila's posture gradually relaxing with each passing day. Apollo seemed to understand her need for patience, matching his pace to her comfort level. When her hands would tighten nervously on the reins, he'd slow his steps. When her breathing grew steady, he'd move with more confidence. One particularly warm afternoon, Mark waited for her by the gate. Something in his expression made her pause as she dismounted. "Come with me," he said, gesturing toward the main training field. Lila's stomach tightened as they walked. The racing track stretched out before them, its surface smooth and inviting in the afternoon sun. But all she could see was that day. The stumble, the fall, the world spinning out of control. "I don't think I can do this," she whispered, her voice catching. Mark leaned against the fence, his weathered face thoughtful. "You know, I had my own fall once. Bad one, too. Shattered my knee. Ended my racing career." He tapped his left leg. "Doctors said I'd never ride again. But that wasn't what nearly stopped me. It was the fear." Lila turned to look at him, surprised. She'd never heard this story before. "Every time I got near a horse, my hands would shake. Couldn't even watch others ride without feeling sick." He paused, meeting her eyes. "You don't forget, Lila, but you decide whether you let it stop you." That night, in the quiet of her bedroom, Lila opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, "Carter and Apollo Racing Highlights." The screen filled with videos from their competition days. She clicked on one from their last season together. There they were, younger Lila sitting tall in the saddle, Apollo's coat gleaming in the sun. They moved like one being, perfectly in sync. The commentator's voice crackled through her speakers. "And here comes the dynamic duo, Carter and Apollo, making it look effortless as always." Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched the footage again and again. They had been unstoppable once, fearless and free. Her finger traced Apollo's image on the screen, remembering how it felt to fly around that track with complete trust in each other. Could she ever get back to that? The question hung heavy in her mind as she stared at the frozen image of their past glory. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Lila arrived at the ranch, her boots crunching on the gravel path. She was adjusting Apollo's saddle blanket when the unmistakable sound of tires on the driveway caught her attention. A sleek black car, polished to mirror shine, pulled up to the ranch house. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that car. Her parents stepped out, looking oddly out of place in their business attire against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. Her father's pressed suit and her mother's elegant cardigan seemed to collect dust just by being there. Lila's hands froze on Apollo's tack. She hadn't told them, hadn't wanted to face their reaction. After the accident, they'd been the ones who pushed hardest for her to move on, to focus on school and forget about riding. "We need to talk," her father said, his voice carrying across the yard. It wasn't angry, just heavy. They gathered around Mark's worn kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee doing little to ease the tension. Her mother's fingers drummed nervously on her cup, while her father sat rigid in his chair. Mark quietly poured coffee and stepped back, giving them space but staying within earshot. "We thought you were done with this," her mother said softly, worry lines creasing her forehead. Lila stared into her untouched coffee. "I was." Her father released a long sigh, the kind that carried years of concern. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Lila. You don't owe this horse anything." Under the table, Lila's fist clenched tight. The words burst out before she could stop them. "Maybe I owe it to myself." The silence that followed felt endless. Her parents exchanged looks, the kind parents give when they think their child is making a mistake, but know they can't stop them. They didn't forbid her from riding. They knew she was too old for that. But their disapproval hung thick in the air like storm clouds. As they left, their car kicking up dust on the driveway, Mark finally broke his silence. He'd been leaning against the counter, watching everything unfold. "You gonna let them decide for you?" he asked simply. Lila straightened her shoulders, a familiar determination settling over her. "Not this time." Without another word, she headed back to Apollo's stall, her steps more purposeful than ever. The morning air was crisp as Mark leaned against the paddock fence, watching Lila guide Apollo around the track. Her posture had changed over the past weeks, less rigid, more fluid. The tight grip on the reins had loosened, and her shoulders no longer hunched with tension. Apollo moved smoothly beneath her, responding to the slightest touch. When she nudged him into a trot, his hooves kicked up small clouds of dust. The steady rhythm of his gait echoed across the paddock. Mark noticed the small smile that crept onto Lila's face as they picked up speed. It wasn't the confident grin from her racing days, but it was genuine, a glimpse of joy breaking through her fear. He straightened up and walked along the fence, keeping pace with them. "There's a local competition next month," he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. The change was instant. Lila's hands tightened on the reins, her knuckles turning white. Apollo sensed her tension and slowed his pace. "No." Her voice was sharp, defensive. Mark shrugged, maintaining his casual tone. "I'm just saying, it's nothing big, just a friendly event. You wouldn't even have to race. Just a simple run." "No," she repeated firmly, her voice harder this time. "I'm not ready." Mark raised his hands in surrender. "All right, but think about it." He turned and walked back to the stable, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That evening, after everyone had left the ranch, Lila sat on her bed, unable to sleep. The word competition kept echoing in her mind. Her heart raced at the mere thought of it. Other riders, spectators, judges. The pressure, the expectations, the possibility of failure. But something else nagged at her, too. A tiny spark of excitement she thought had died years ago. She remembered the thrill of competition, the rush of adrenaline, the partnership with Apollo. Those memories weren't all bad. The next morning, she stood by the paddock watching Apollo graze peacefully in the early light. His coat gleamed in the sun, muscles rippling under his skin, still strong, still capable. "What if I tried?" she whispered under her breath. So quiet it was barely audible. Apollo's ears flicked toward her voice, his head lifting slightly. He looked at her with those knowing eyes, and something shifted in Lila's heart. A possibility she hadn't allowed herself to consider was taking shape, though she wasn't ready to speak it aloud just yet. The digital clock on Lila's nightstand blinked 12:43 a.m., its red numbers casting a dim glow across her bedroom. She rolled over for what felt like the 100th time, pulling her pillow closer, only to push it away again in frustration. Mark's words kept echoing in her head. "It's nothing big, just a friendly event." Her mind raced with possibilities and fears, making sleep impossible. With a defeated sigh, she threw off her covers and pulled on her boots. The wooden floors creaked softly under her feet as she made her way downstairs and out into the night. The ranch was peaceful at this hour. Crickets chirped their gentle symphony, and a cool breeze rustled through the leaves of the old oak trees. Gravel crunched beneath her boots as she walked to the stables, drawn by an urge she couldn't explain. Apollo's head lifted at her approach, his ears perking forward in recognition. His soft nicker broke through the silence as she reached his stall. "Hey, boy," she whispered, running her hand along his velvet muzzle. "What if I tried?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Without letting herself think too hard about it, she grabbed his saddle and bridle. Her hands moved with practiced ease, muscle memory taking over as she tightened the girth and adjusted the stirrups. Apollo stood perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of this moment. The moonlight painted everything in silver as they walked toward the training field. Lila's heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. With a gentle squeeze of her legs, she urged Apollo into a trot. His hooves made soft thuds against the packed earth. Gathering her courage, she asked for more speed. Apollo responded immediately, breaking into a smooth gallop. The night air whipped past her face, cool and clean. Her hair streamed behind her like a banner, and for one glorious moment, all her fears fell away. She felt weightless, free, connected to Apollo in a way she hadn't been since before the accident. Then they approached the turn, that fateful spot where everything had gone wrong years ago. Her body tensed automatically, her hands pulling back on the reins before she even realized what she was doing. Apollo responded instantly, slowing to a stop, his sides heaving slightly beneath her legs. Lila sat motionless in the saddle, staring down at the patch of ground where she'd fallen. In the moonlight, it looked like any other piece of earth, but to her, it might as well have been marked with a warning sign. Her hands trembled slightly on the reins. "Not tonight," she whispered, patting Apollo's neck. "But soon." They turned back toward the barn, walking quietly through the silver-drenched night. Neither of them noticed Mark standing on the darkened porch, a knowing smirk playing across his face as he watched them return. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Lila pushed her scrambled eggs around her plate. Mark sat across from her, reading yesterday's newspaper and sipping his coffee. The only sounds were the distant nickering of horses and the scrape of her fork against china. "I want to try the competition," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark carefully folded his newspaper and set it aside. He took another sip of coffee, hiding the satisfaction in his expression behind a casual nod. "All right, let's get to work." Over the next few days, their routine changed dramatically. The casual rides transformed into focused training sessions. Mark worked with Lila on perfecting her turns, practicing smooth transitions between walking, trotting, and galloping. They spent hours in the paddock, building both her and Apollo's stamina. Lila's body remembered everything: the proper posture, the subtle shifts in weight, the gentle guidance of the reins. But Mark could see the hesitation in her movements. She rode like someone walking on thin ice, always testing each step before committing. One particularly frustrating afternoon, after Apollo refused a turn for the third time, Mark watched her from his spot by the fence. Her movements were technically correct, but lacked conviction. She brought Apollo to a stop, clearly frustrated. "You're riding safe, not strong," Mark called out, his voice firm but kind. "Apollo can feel that." Lila turned in the saddle, fixing him with a glare. "I'm trying." "I know," he said, meeting her gaze steadily. "But at some point, you have to decide. Are you here to finish what you started, or to run from it?" Later that night, Lila sat cross-legged on her bed, her laptop balanced on her knees. The screen glowed with old racing footage, videos from before the accident. She watched her younger self guide Apollo through complex maneuvers with absolute confidence. There was a fire in her eyes then, an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. Her finger traced the screen, following the movement of her past self. "I want that back," she whispered into the darkness of her room. In that quiet moment, as she watched the fearless girl she used to be, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just about proving something anymore. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she'd lost. The morning air was crisp as Mark's truck rumbled down the familiar country road. Lila sat in the passenger seat, assuming they were headed to the ranch for another training session. But when Mark took an unexpected turn, her body tensed. She knew this route all too well. "Mark?" Her voice trembled slightly as the old racing track came into view. The place looked exactly the same. The weathered wooden fence, the red clay track, the tall oak trees lining the far curve. Mark parked the truck and got out without a word. Lila remained frozen in her seat until he opened her door. "Come on," he said gently. Her legs felt like lead as she followed him onto the track. The morning dew still clung to the grass, making her boots slightly damp. Apollo stood quietly in the trailer, watching them through the window. Mark led her to a specific spot on the track, the exact place where everything had changed. Lila's hands instinctively crossed over her chest, where her collarbone had once been shattered. "Do you actually remember the accident?" Mark asked, his voice unexpectedly soft. Lila nodded, then hesitated. "Not all of it," she admitted. The memories came in flashes, the sensation of falling, the impact, the confusion. But the actual moment, the reason why it happened, remained blurry. Mark sighed, his eyes scanning the ground. "Then let me tell you what I know." He crouched down, running his hand over the track's surface. "Apollo didn't stumble because of anything you did. There was a depression in the ground, right here." He pointed to a spot that had long since been repaired. The track maintenance had been neglected. Apollo tripped because of uneven ground, not because of your mistake. He stood up, looking her directly in the eyes. "It wasn't your fault, Lila." The words hit her like a physical force. She stumbled slightly, her breath catching in her throat. All these years, she'd carried the weight of that day, convinced she'd failed both herself and Apollo. The guilt had become such a familiar companion that letting it go felt almost impossible. Mark walked to the trailer and returned with Apollo, holding out the reins to her. Time to rewrite the memory. Lila's hands shook as she took them. Apollo stood perfectly still as she mounted, his ears turned back toward her, listening. The familiar leather of the saddle creaked beneath her as she settled in. Her heart pounded as she urged Apollo forward. They approached the spot, that terrible, haunted spot, at a steady trot. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to turn back, but she kept going. Apollo's hooves passed over the place where they'd fallen, and then they were beyond it, moving faster now, their shadows stretching long across the morning track. The wind whipped through her hair as Apollo broke into a gallop. This time, she didn't pull back. This time, she didn't stop. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the training field as Mark leaned against the fence, watching Lila warm up Apollo. The competition was just days away, and he could see both rider and horse were ready, even if Lila didn't quite believe it yet. "All right," he called out, pushing off the fence. "Time for the real test." Lila guided Apollo toward him, her expression uncertain. "What do you mean?" "Full speed," Mark said simply. "If you can do this now, you can do it on race day." Lila's face paled slightly, but she nodded. She'd come too far to back down now. Guiding Apollo to the starting position, she took several deep breaths to steady herself. The familiar pre-run jitters buzzed through her body. But this time they felt different, more like excitement than fear. Her fingers tightened around the reins as she settled into position. Apollo stood perfectly still beneath her, but she could feel the energy building in his muscles. He remembered this too. The anticipation, the focus, before a run. "Ready?" Mark called from the fence. Lila gave a short nod, then clicked her tongue, their old signal to run. Apollo responded instantly, surging forward with practiced power. The sudden acceleration pushed Lila back slightly, but her body remembered what to do. She leaned forward, finding that perfect balance point as Apollo's hooves thundered against the ground. The rush was incredible. Wind whipped past her face, bringing tears to her eyes. Apollo's powerful strides ate up the ground beneath them, and for a moment, Lila felt like they were flying. It was exactly how she remembered it, exactly what she'd been missing all these years. But as they approached the final turn, that familiar flicker of panic sparked in her chest. Her muscles tensed, ready to pull back. "Trust him." Mark's voice cut through her fear. Something shifted inside her at those words. For the first time since the accident, Lila truly let go. She loosened her grip on the reins, giving Apollo his head. The big horse responded immediately, adjusting his stride with perfect precision. They took the turn together, Apollo's body leaning into it while Lila moved with him, completely in sync. They cleared the turn with ease, straightening out for the final stretch. Lila couldn't help the breathless laugh that escaped her as they crossed the imaginary finish line, gradually slowing to a stop. Mark walked over, that knowing smirk on his face. "Now you're ready." Wiping sweat from her brow, Lila realized she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. "Yeah," she said, patting Apollo's neck. "I think I am." The morning sun crept over the competition grounds, bathing the arena in a warm golden light. The familiar scents of hay, leather, and horses filled the air, but today they made Lila's stomach twist with nerves. She stood near Apollo's stall, her fingers absently running through his mane as her heart pounded against her ribs. In the distance, the growing crowd of spectators sent up occasional cheers that made her shiver despite the warm morning. Mark's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, adjusting his worn baseball cap. His weathered face bore a calm expression as he studied her. "You nervous?" Lila let out a sharp breath, managing a shaky smile. "Terrified." As they worked together to saddle Apollo, Lila couldn't help but notice the other competitors warming up their horses in the practice ring. The sight of their fluid movements and confident postures made her throat tight. Then she noticed the sideways glances, the hushed conversations. Some of the older riders recognized her. Their whispers carried on the morning breeze. "That's the girl who wrecked Apollo. Can't believe she's back. Wonder if she'll freeze up again." Her fingers trembled as she tightened Apollo's girth, checking it twice as the murmurs continued. Doubt crept into her mind like a cold shadow, making her question everything: her training, her decision to compete, even her right to be here. Mark's firm hand on her shoulder startled her from her spiral of negative thoughts. "Ignore them," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "They don't know the full story. You do." Lila took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs completely before releasing it slowly. She straightened her shoulders, grounding herself in the moment. The familiar leather of Apollo's reins in her hands, his steady breathing, Mark's unwavering presence, all of it reminded her that she belonged here. As she led Apollo toward the waiting area, a familiar voice caught her attention from behind. Her steps faltered as she turned to see her parents standing at the fence. Her mother's face was etched with concern, hands clasped tightly together. But her father, who had been so opposed to her return to riding, gave her a slight nod, his expression softening with unexpected approval. Lila swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I can do this," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Lila swung onto Apollo's back, her movements careful but determined. The warm-up ring stretched before them, filled with other riders practicing their final moves. The familiar weight of the saddle beneath her brought back a flood of memories, both the triumphs and the fall that had changed everything. But this time, the memories didn't paralyze her. Apollo moved beneath her with the same grace she remembered, his hooves marking a steady rhythm against the ground. Each step felt like coming home, like finding a piece of herself she'd thought was lost forever. His ears flicked back to catch her commands, just as attentive as he'd been years ago. When their number was called, Lila guided Apollo toward the competition ring. The crowd fell silent as they entered, and she could feel dozens of eyes following their every move. The course lay before them, a series of precise turns and carefully placed obstacles that would test both rider and horse. She took a deep breath and gave Apollo the signal to begin. They started slowly, methodically tackling each obstacle. The first turn came smoothly, then the second. Apollo responded to her lightest touch, moving as if they'd never been apart. The rhythm of his gait steadied her nerves, helping her focus on each challenge as it came. Through the slalom they went, weaving between poles with careful precision. Lila found herself settling deeper into the saddle, muscle memory taking over. The worried whispers from the crowd faded away until it was just her and Apollo, moving as one. As they approached the final stretch, something shifted inside her. A spark of the old confidence flickered to life, and she allowed Apollo to pick up his pace just slightly. They cleared the last obstacle with room to spare, crossing the finish line in one fluid motion. The announcer's voice broke through her focus. Number 147, Lila Carter and Apollo, clean run, time places them in 4th position. Mark stood waiting by the gate as she dismounted, his usual stoic expression barely hiding his pride. Not bad for someone who was terrified this morning, he said, with a slight smirk. Lila let out a breathless laugh, her legs still shaky from the adrenaline. Not bad at all. The announcer's voice crackled over the speakers, calling riders to the final event. Lila's stomach churned as she led Apollo to the starting line. This was different from the precision course. This was pure speed, raw power, everything she'd been afraid of since the accident. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the reins. The track stretched before them, ending with that infamous turn, the one that had haunted her dreams for years. Around her, other riders took their positions, but Lila barely noticed them. Her world had narrowed to just her and Apollo. She glanced down at her partner, expecting to see some reflection of her anxiety. Instead, Apollo stood perfectly calm, his ears focused forward, muscles relaxed, but ready. His quiet confidence struck her. After everything they'd been through, he trusted her completely. Mark's words from their training sessions echoed in her mind. Trust him. Such simple words, but they held the key to everything. The starting signal dropped. Apollo sprang forward with explosive power, and the world became a blur of color and sound. The thunder of hooves filled her ears as they accelerated down the track. Wind whipped at her face, and something strange happened. The fear began to fade, replaced by pure adrenaline. This feeling, this rush, she remembered now why she loved racing so much. Then the final turn loomed ahead. Panic flared in her chest, memories of the fall threatening to overwhelm her. But this time, instead of tightening her grip and trying to control everything, Lila did something different. She loosened the reins slightly, letting Apollo find his own balance. She trusted him. Apollo responded instantly, adjusting his stride and taking the turn with fluid grace. No stumble, no hesitation, just pure, natural movement. They cleared the turn and thundered across the finish line together. Tears stung Lila's eyes as they slowed to a stop. She didn't care about her placement or time. She'd done it. She'd faced her fears and finished the race. Mark was waiting at the gate, that knowing smile on his face. "Told you," he said simply. Lila laughed, still breathless from the run. "Shut up." As Lila dismounted, her legs shaky from the intense ride, she spotted her parents pushing through the dispersing crowd. Her mother's face was a mixture of relief and joy as she wrapped Lila in a tight embrace. "I was so scared for you," her mother whispered, squeezing her daughter close. Her father, a man who rarely showed emotion, placed a firm hand on her shoulder. His eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen in years. "We're proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, calling everyone's attention to the final results. Lila held her breath as the names were read out. She hadn't won first place, but when her name was called for 8th position, her heart soared. A top 10 finish, something she wouldn't have dreamed possible just months ago. As people began to drift away from the announcement board, one of the riders who had been whispering about her earlier approached. It was Sarah Martinez, a veteran competitor known for her harsh judgments. The woman's face was serious as she stopped in front of Lila. "You rode well," Sarah said simply, giving a small nod of approval before walking away. Lila watched her go, realizing something important. The whispers, the judgment, the opinions of others, none of it mattered anymore. She hadn't come back to prove anything to them. She'd done this for herself, and that was enough. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as people began packing up their equipment. Mark approached, leading Apollo by the reins. The old trainer's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "You did good, kid," he said, holding out the reins to her. Lila took them, stepping close to Apollo. She stroked his velvet nose, feeling the warmth of his breath against her palm. "I think we're just getting started," she replied softly. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stables as Lila led Apollo away from the competition grounds. Her muscles ached with each step, but there was a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. The familiar sense of hay and leather surrounded her as they made their way to Apollo's temporary stall. Mark fell into step beside her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "So, how does it feel?" he asked, watching her with knowing eyes. Lila took a deep breath, considering his question. "Like I finally let go of something I didn't even realize I was still holding on to." The words felt right as soon as she said them, naming the strange peace that had settled over her. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Mark's approval was quiet but genuine. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Her parents walked up, looking more relaxed than they had all day. The tension that had been present in their shoulders earlier had melted away. Her father's eyes wandered around the stables, taking in the familiar environment before settling on Apollo. "Are you thinking about riding competitively again?" he asked, his voice careful, measured. Lila's hand stilled on Apollo's reins as she considered the question. After a moment, she shook her head. "Not for now. I think I just want to enjoy it again first." Inside Apollo's stall, Lila worked the brush over his coat in slow, methodical strokes. Each movement helped ground her in the present moment. She loved the thrill of competition. That hadn't changed. But there was something deeper now, a simple joy in just being here with Apollo, in feeling the rhythm of caring for him. Mark leaned against the stall door, watching her work. "So, what now?" he asked. A small smile tugged at her lips as she continued brushing. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I think I want to find out." The morning sun painted long shadows across the pasture as Lila guided Apollo through the tall grass. There was no schedule to keep, no time to beat, just the gentle rhythm of hoofbeats against soft earth. She'd been coming to the ranch every day since the competition, but something felt different now. The weight of expectations had lifted, leaving behind pure joy in its place. Apollo seemed to sense the change too. His stride was relaxed, ears flicking contentedly as they wandered the sprawling fields together. Sometimes they'd break into a canter, not because they had to, but simply because they wanted to feel the wind in their faces. Lila found herself smiling more these days. She'd forgotten how much she loved just being with horses, especially Apollo. They weren't training for anything anymore. They were just two old friends finding their way back to each other. As the evening approached, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, Mark's voice called out from the barn. "Lila, got a minute?" She guided Apollo back, curious about the unusual summons. Mark rarely called anyone into his office. He preferred conversations in the barn aisle or by the fence. Inside his small office, Mark sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and old racing photographs. He held a worn piece of paper in his hands, studying it before looking up at her. "I've been thinking," he said, placing what she now recognized as a deed on the desk. "Apollo has passed from one owner to another for too long. He needs a real home." Lila's heart skipped a beat as the meaning of his words sank in. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "You're giving him to me?" Mark's familiar smirk appeared. "Technically, you're buying him, but I figured you might want to negotiate." A laugh bubbled up from her chest, mixing with the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Through the window, she could see Apollo grazing peacefully in the paddock, his coat gleaming in the evening light. Looking back at Mark, there wasn't a trace of doubt in her voice when she answered, "I'll take him." The morning dew still clung to the grass as Lila finished preparing Apollo for their last ride at the ranch. Her heart felt full, yet strange, a mixture of excitement and nostalgia washing over her as she thought about taking Apollo home tomorrow. Mark appeared with his own horse, already saddled and ready to go. "How about one for the road?" he suggested, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Just us, the horses, and open country." Lila nodded, grateful for the invitation. It felt right to share this moment with the man who'd helped her find her way back to herself. They set out as the sun climbed higher, their horses moving in perfect sync. The familiar landscape stretched before them, rolling hills, scattered oak trees, and endless sky. Mark picked up the pace, and Lila followed suit, letting Apollo stretch into a full gallop. The wind whipped through her hair as they raced across the countryside, their laughter carried away by the breeze. In that moment, Lila felt herself transported back in time to when she was younger, fearless, riding purely for the joy of it. But this time was different. She wasn't just that carefree girl anymore. She was stronger, wiser, more complete. They slowed their horses at the top of a hill, both slightly breathless and grinning. Mark turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about coaching?" "Coaching?" Lila's eyebrows rose in surprise. He shrugged, adjusting his hat. "You've been through a lot. Maybe someday you could help someone else through the same thing." Lila felt quiet, considering his words. The idea had never occurred to her before, but now that he mentioned it, something about it felt right. She knew what it was like to be afraid, to doubt yourself, to fight your way back. Maybe she could help others do the same. As they turned their horses toward home, Lila looked over at Apollo, who was walking contentedly beside Mark's horse. "We did it, didn't we?" Apollo's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice, as if agreeing with her assessment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Lila stood next to Apollo, her fingers gently running through his dark mane. The familiar scent of hay and leather filled the air, while her packed truck and horse trailer waited nearby, ready for their journey home. Mark approached, holding out a manila envelope containing Apollo's ownership papers. His weathered face held a mix of pride and nostalgia as he handed them to her. "He's yours now," he said simply, his gruff voice carrying more emotion than he usually allowed. Lila clutched the papers to her chest, overwhelmed by the finality of the moment. Apollo nudged her shoulder gently, as if reassuring her that everything would be okay. Her parents stood a short distance away, watching the scene unfold. The tension that had marked their earlier visits to the ranch had melted away, replaced by quiet acceptance. Her father stepped forward, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I never thought I'd see this day," he admitted, shaking his head slowly. "But I'm glad I did." The words carried the weight of years of worry and doubt, now transformed into understanding. Lila's mother wrapped her in a tight hug, whispering words of encouragement in her ear. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. Turning back to Mark, Lila felt her throat tighten with emotion. This man had given her back more than just her connection with Apollo. He'd helped her reclaim herself. "Thank you for everything," she managed to say. Mark chuckled, trying to lighten the moment. "Just promise me you won't let him get lazy." "Not a chance," Lila replied with a grin, grateful for his attempt to keep things from becoming too emotional. After one final check of the trailer's locks and hitches, Lila climbed into the driver's seat of her truck. Apollo stood quietly in the trailer, his presence steady and reassuring. As she adjusted the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of herself and barely recognized the person looking back. Gone was the fear that had haunted her eyes for so long. In its place was something new: confidence, peace, acceptance. The ranch began to shrink in her rearview mirror as she pulled away, but Lila didn't feel the pang of loss she'd expected. Instead, a profound sense of peace settled over her. She wasn't the same girl who had run from her past anymore. She had faced it head on, pushed through it, and emerged stronger on the other side. The truck rolled steadily down the dusty road, carrying her and Apollo toward their new beginning. If you enjoyed the story of Lila and Apollo, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.